Welcome to Occult Archives, where we uncover the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most feared books. From mystical grimoires to ancient religious texts, these books carry secrets too dangerous to be read. Are you ready to turn the pages of the unknown? This is Season 1, Episode 11, The Zohar, Mystical Secrets of the Universe. Let's dive in.
And today we're embarking on a deep dive into a really singular work.
Yeah.
It's often called the Book of Splendor, or the Book of Radiance.
The Zohar.
The Zohar, exactly.
And it's amazing to think that this book, which kind of appeared without, a grand announcement, went on to have this monumental impact on Judaism. For about 300 years, from the 1500s to the 1800s, it wasn't just influential, it was a cornerstone holding a place of authority right alongside the Bible and the Talmud.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, can you think of any other piece of Jewish writing that ever reached that kind of status?
It's remarkable. It's really remarkable.
No other work in Jewish literature achieved that kind of almost canonical standing. I mean, consider Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, a hugely important philosophical text, but its journey was quite different. The Zohar, as you mentioned, emerged anonymously and initially spoke to a smaller group of people who were seeking a more mystical understanding of their faith. And its influence wasn't immediate, but it grew steadily, almost like an organic movement.
And it's fascinating how it navigated those early days. There were even some whispers of scandal around how it appeared, right?
Sure.
But those eventually faded.
Exactly. The questions surrounding who wrote it and where it came from did create some initial controversy, but ultimately the power of its content and the spiritual yearning it addressed became the dominant forces.
Yeah.
And what's particularly interesting is that for many who embraced the Zohar, the profound impact it had on their soul wasn't even dependent on fully grasping all its complexities. There was a deep-seated belief that simply engaging with it held a transformative power, almost like a sacred object in itself.
Almost like, yeah. But then the way people thought about things shifted, didn't it? I mean, the Enlightenment brought a very different lens to bear.
It did. During the Enlightenment, the Zohar underwent a significant reassessment. And unfortunately for its reputation in some circles, it was often viewed very negatively. It was dismissed by some as a book of lies, seen as clouding what they believed were the more rational foundations of Judaism. So you can see how even the most influential texts can have their reputations rise and fall with the times.
It really does. Now, when we talk about the Zohar itself, it's not like picking up a neatly organized philosophical argument, right?
Not at all. The Zohar, as we have it today, is more akin to a collection, a tapestry, woven from different threads. It's a compilation of various pieces, interpretations of specific passages from the Bible, homilies or sermons, and even what appear to be records of discussions and teachings attributed to Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, a significant 2nd century figure, and his circle of disciples.
So like hearing many different voices and styles all within the same book.
Exactly.
Now, I understand that the main part of it tries to echo an older style of Jewish writing, the Midrash.
That's right. The main body of the Zohar, which follows the structure of the first 5 books of the Bible, deliberately imitates the ancient Midrash form that you find in writings from the early centuries of the Common Era. However, it also incorporates elements of the medieval sermon style, which means you get longer, more structured pieces than you typically see in those older midrashim.
Okay, so it's really a blend of these older and newer literary approaches.
Exactly.
It sounds like a fascinating mix. And within this collection, there are specific sections that have their own unique character, right? Like the Midrash HaNe'elam.
Yes, the Midrash HaNe'elam, which translates to the secret Midrash, appears in various parts of the Pentateuch, often running alongside the main sections.
Okay.
While it does mention Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai and his group, it largely avoids the deeper, more explicit mystical and theosophical discussions that you find elsewhere in the Zohar. Instead, its primary focus is on radical allegorical interpretations of the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay.
Using these narratives to explore the journey of the soul, both before and after death. And these allegories definitely show the influence of 13th century philosophical preaching.
Okay, so it's more focused on the ethical and perhaps philosophical implications of those foundational stories.
Yeah.
And then there's the Sefer Torah.
The Sefer Torah, or Secrets of the Torah, acts as a sort of bridge between these different styles.
Yeah.
It largely moves away from the Midrash form and the specific attribution of sayings to particular individuals. It represents a transition from that more philosophical and eschatological allegory that we see in the secret Midrash towards a more explicitly mystical form of interpreting the Bible. So it's like the mystical ideas are starting to come into sharper focus there.
Right. Right. The mystical core begins to reveal itself more directly.
Exactly.
Now, I've also come across mentions of the Idra Rabbah and the Idra Zuta. Those sound particularly intriguing.
They are. They're central and very intense pieces within the Zohar's mystical framework. The Idra Rabbah, which means the Great Assembly, presents a very elaborate and structured description of the mystical figure of the deity, using the complex symbolism of what's called primal man.
Wow.
Then in the Idra Zuta, the Small Assembly, Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai revisits this same theme in a profound monologue that he delivers just before his death, an event that is portrayed with great detail and significance in that section. You also find anonymous Mishnayot scattered throughout the Zohar, adding another layer to its textual complexity. So you see how the Zohar isn't one monolithic text, but rather layers of interpretation and mystical exploration building upon each other.
It's quite a diverse collection of writings, all under this one title. This naturally brings us to a central question. Who actually wrote all of this? The issue of origin and authorship seems to be a major point of discussion when it comes to the Zohar.
Absolutely. The question of who penned the Zohar has been debated for centuries. One of the most forceful views came from the historian Heinrich Graetz. He attributed the entire Zohar, without exception, to the Spanish Kabbalist Moses de Leon, who died in 1305. And Graetz didn't hold back in his assessment. He vehemently criticized de Leon, seeing the Zohar as nothing more than a work of deception and charlatanism. Poor de Leon's reputation really suffered in Graetz's view, with little credit given even for the immense intellectual effort involved in creating such a work, regardless of its claimed authenticity.
So a very strong stance indeed. On the other end of the spectrum, I understand there was a view that saw the Zohar as more of an anonymous, organic creation?
Exactly. Especially in the generation before our own, many scholars viewed the Zohar as a work that didn't have a single author or unifying hand behind it. They proposed that it developed gradually and anonymously over time, becoming a repository for the diverse and sometimes contradictory ideas that were circulating within the Kabbalistic movement. In this view, Moses de Leon was seen more as an editor or redactor of older writings and fragments, perhaps adding some of his own material along the way. So almost a collective creation in a way.
Almost like a tradition that accreted over time.
Right.
And I've also heard talk about so-called primitive sources existing within the Zohar.
Yes. The idea that the Zohar contains older primitive sources, even if they were later revised or incorporated, has gained some traction. This theory, while appealing to some because it paints the Zohar as a kind of anonymous product of a collective folk spirit, much like how some people view the Bible or the Talmud, actually lacks solid philological or critical evidence to back it up.
Yeah.
But as the saying goes, what seems plausible can sometimes gain acceptance even without rigorous proof.
It's interesting how these different theories really reflect broader ways of understanding the origins of religious texts in general.
Yeah.
But where does current scholarly thinking generally stand on this question of authorship?
Contemporary research, including the extensive work done by Gershom Scholem, whose selection we're exploring today, has largely concluded that the Zohar is mainly a unified book that originated in the late 13th century.
Okay.
Attempts to definitively prove that significant portions of it predate the mid-13th century have consistently run into evidence that suggests otherwise. So more of a singular vision, albeit a very complex and multifaceted one.
So while it's a rich tapestry, it's likely woven by a central hand.
Exactly.
And within this unified work, are there still discernible layers or distinct sections that might represent different stages or focuses?
Yes. Scholem identified three primary strata within the Zohar literature. First, you have the Midrash HaNilam, which, based on its philosophical terminology and its partial use of Hebrew rather than the Aramaic that dominates the rest, is likely the earliest layer. Then you have the main body of the Zohar, which includes the Idra Rabbah, Idra Zuta, and Seder Torah. This forms the core of the entire work.
Okay.
Finally, there's the Raya Mehemna and the Tikkuni Zohar, and these appear to have been authored by a single individual who was already familiar with the main Zohar.
It sounds like we're looking at the work of a central figure, likely someone with a strong grounding in both philosophy and Talmudic learning, who then became deeply immersed in Kabbalistic thought.
Precisely. The Zohar really appears to be the creation of a mystic who, starting with a traditional intellectual foundation, increasingly gravitated towards the mystical and perhaps even Gnostic-influenced ideas of Kabbalah, eventually focusing entirely on developing this remarkable talent for mystical homiletics, the art of interpreting sacred texts through sermons and discourses. It's quite astonishing when you consider that it took half a millennium for Jewish literature to produce anything comparable in terms of its impact and its unique style. This wasn't just someone compiling things, it was a homiletic genius who drew deeply from the existing Kabbalistic literature up to the time of Moses ben Naaman, who lived in the 13th century.
And based on the evidence, what's the likely time and place of its composition?
The consensus among scholars points to around the year 1280 in Spain, and interestingly by a Kabbalist who had never actually visited Palestine.
Oh, wow.
This conclusion is supported by a range of linguistic features and factual details within the text itself.
Now, one of the more intriguing aspects is the Zohar's pervasive use of pseudepigraphy, attributing the work and its teachings to Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai and setting the narrative in the Galilean landscape of the 2nd century.
All right.
How seriously did the author likely intend this literary device to be taken by his readers?
That's a crucial question to consider. The author clearly took great pleasure in creating this midrash-like setting, complete with invented book titles and citations attributed to the various figures who appear in the dialogues. This use of pseudonymity later sparked considerable debate and even moral condemnation in some circles. However, given that earlier Kabbalistic literature also employed pseudepigraphy, and the Zohar author himself penned other works using similar techniques like the Testament of Rabbi Eliezer the Great, it's uncertain just how literally he expected this attribution to be taken. It may have functioned more as a literary convention, a way to lend authority and a sense of ancient wisdom and mystique to the teachings being presented, so perhaps not intended as outright forgery in the modern sense, but more as a way of framing these mystical insights within a revered historical context.
Okay, so a way to tap into the authority of the past to convey new, profound ideas.
Exactly.
And the argument for Moses de Leon himself being the actual author has gained significant traction in modern scholarship, hasn't it?
Yes. While some of the earlier pieces of evidence used to support that hypothesis have been challenged or reinterpreted, some compelling new evidence has indeed emerged. Notably, a manuscript of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed was discovered in Moscow, and it bears an inscription stating that it was written for Moses de Leon in the year 1264.
Okay.
This is a really crucial chronological detail because it helps to fill in a significant gap in our understanding of his early life, providing those 20 empty years before he began writing under his own name, which happens to be precisely the time frame needed for the conception and initial writing of the Zohar's first 2 strata.
That's a pretty striking piece of the puzzle. It strongly suggests a potential intellectual journey for him, from engaging with the rational philosophy of someone like Maimonides in the Guide to developing the deeply esoteric mysticism that we find in the Zohar.
Exactly. The intellectual trajectory from reading the Guide to the kind of eschatological mysticism found in Moses de Leon's later work, The Book of the Rational Soul, really closely mirrors the inner development that scholars have discerned within the Zohar itself, moving from more philosophical allegory towards deeper mystical and theosophical interpretations of Scripture.
Yeah.
And as Cohen persuasively argues, none of the other known Spanish Kabbalists of that period quite fit the complex profile of the Zohar's author. So unless you want to posit a completely unknown great unknown, Moses de Leon remains the most likely candidate for having penned this monumental and influential work.
It's a compelling case, to be sure. Now let's turn our attention to the language itself. The Zohar isn't written in standard Hebrew, is it? It has its own very distinct flavor.
No, it's written in a very distinctive Zohar Aramaic.
Yeah.
This sustained karasuro, as Skolem aptly calls it, this interplay of light and shadow in the language itself, really lends the ideas a venerable and somewhat mysterious quality. If these ideas had been expressed in the more straightforward Hebrew of the 13th century, they might not have had the same profound and lasting impact.
Yeah.
The language itself became an integral part of the Zohar's mystique, almost cloaking the teachings in an aura of ancient wisdom.
It does create that sense of peering into something ancient and profound.
Right.
But I imagine this unique linguistic style can also make it quite challenging to understand for someone approaching the text for the first time.
It certainly can. Often, to truly grasp the intended meaning of a passage in the Zohar, you actually need to retranslate it into the Hebrew of contemporary Kabbalah. Interestingly, Moses de Leon's own Hebrew writings are particularly helpful in unlocking many of the Zohar's linguistic puzzles. Furthermore, the Zohar frequently employs new word formations, sometimes seemingly arbitrary, and occasionally even derived from what appear to be corrupted forms of Talmudic words found in medieval manuscripts, or perhaps from similar kinds of misunderstandings. So a deep dive into the Zohar often requires not just understanding the conceptual framework, but also navigating its very unique linguistic landscape.
It sounds like a scholar's playground and a beginner's hurdle all rolled into one.
Exactly.
Now, for our listeners who are joining us on this particular deep dive, we obviously can't cover the entirety of this vast and complex work today. What's the focus of the specific readings that you've selected for us?
Well, our aim for this deep dive isn't to provide a comprehensive overview of the Zohar's entire mystical doctrine. That would really require far more time than we have, and a significant amount of explanatory notes. Instead, we've carefully selected passages that illuminate some of the key mystical ideas concerning God, the different stages of his manifestation or unfolding, and the concept of the soul, including its various levels or grades and its ultimate destiny, as it's taught within the Zohar. What's fascinating is that in many cases, one passage can actually shed light on another, creating a kind of internal coherence.
And I understand that you've chosen to maintain the original order of these passages as they appear within the Zohar itself.
Yes. Given the interconnected nature of the Zohar's teachings, it seemed most appropriate to follow the original sequence of the text. This way, you can get a better sense of how these ideas unfold and build upon each other within the broader context of the work. Our hope is that this selection will offer you, our listener, a glimpse into the powerful contemplative imagination and the rich evocative imagery that lies within what might seem at first glance to be the rather abstruse thinking of the Kabbalists.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We're starting right at the very beginning with the Zohar's interpretation of the creation narrative.
Right.
That foundational in the beginning from Genesis.
Exactly. The Zohar's interpretation of in the beginning, Genesis 1.1, is incredibly rich with mystical significance. It describes the initial emergence of God's will taking effect, with signs being, in a sense, engraved into the heavenly sphere that surrounds him. From the deepest, most hidden recess of Ein Sof, the infinite, that aspect of God beyond all comprehension, there issued forth a dark flame.
Wow.
It's likened to a fog forming within the unformed enclosed within that primordial sphere. This initial manifestation is described as being neither white nor black, but veiled in its own inherent darkness.
This paints a very different picture from the traditional image of creation beginning with light.
Yeah.
This dark flame, what does it represent in this mystical context?
Well, the Zohar emphasizes that beyond this initial point of emanation, nothing can truly be grasped or known about the infinite, the Ein Sof. Therefore, this first word of creation, reshit, meaning beginning, is seen as the very first of 10 divine utterances through which the entire universe was brought into being.
Right.
Interestingly, the Zohar specifically identifies this primordial point, this first stirring of creation, with the wisdom of God, or Chokhmah in Hebrew, which is understood as the ideal thought or blueprint of all of creation. So instead of a sudden burst of light, the Zohar begins with a veiled potential, suggesting that true understanding requires penetrating the surface, a key insight into its entire approach.
So the universe doesn't begin with a flash of light, but with this mysterious dark flame emerging from the unknowable infinite, a point that embodies divine wisdom. That's a powerful and thought-provoking image.
Yes.
From there, we move to the intriguing concept of shell and kernel.
Yes, this is a really key analogy that the Zohar uses repeatedly to explain the complex relationship between the spiritual realms and our own material world. Drawing inspiration from King Solomon's imagery of descending into a garden of nuts in the Song of Songs Canticles 6.11, the Zohar uses the structure of a nut, its outer shell, and the layers within as an analogy for the different spirits or forces that clothe the brain, which in this context represents the divine realm.
Okay.
Just as a nut has layers of shell that protect the precious kernel at its center, so too are there successive layers of spiritual veils that surround the innermost divine light, concealing it from direct perception. Think of it as a way to understand how the infinite can interact with the finite through these intermediary layers.
And what is at this primal center, this innermost kernel that all these layers are protecting?
The primal center is described as an innermost light of unimaginable translucence, subtlety, and purity. This absolute central point then expands outwards, becoming a palace, which acts as an enclosure for this core. This palace also possesses a radiant quality that is beyond our comprehension. This palace, in turn, becomes like a vestment for itself, leading to the creation of further layers, each one becoming progressively less subtle and less translucent than the one before it. This process continues, with the Zohar explaining that when the female aspect representing the lower realms, or the principle of reception, was given its own governance. Its inherent light was diminished, and layer after layer, shell after shell, was fashioned to invest this brain, all ultimately for the benefit and the unfolding of the divine plan.
It's a fascinating hierarchical image, with
Yes.
layers of diminishing radiance emanating from that unknowable, intensely bright core.
Exactly.
Next in our readings, we encounter the first light.
Yes.
This seems like a more familiar concept when we talk about creation narratives.
It does. But as you'll see, the Zohar gives it its own unique mystical spin.
Okay.
When God said, "Let there be light," Genesis 1:3,
Yeah.
this wasn't just any light that was created. It was the primal light, a very specific and powerful emanation from God, which the Zohar even identifies as the light of the eye.
Oh.
The Zohar goes on to say that God showed this extraordinary light to Adam, the first human, enabling him to see from one end of the world to the other. It was also shown to King David, inspiring his profound psalms of praise. And it revealed the land of Israel to Moses from afar when he stood on Mount Nebo.
But this incredibly powerful light wasn't something that remained constantly accessible to everyone, was it?
No. According to the Zohar, foreseeing the rise of sinful generations, specifically mentioning those of Enoch, the Great Flood, and the building of the Tower of Babel, God deliberately withdrew this primal light from their ability to experience its full glory.
Wow.
It was then, in a special act of grace given to Moses during the 3 months that his mother Jochebed hid him after his birth, protecting him from Pharaoh's decree. However, even when Moses was later brought before Pharaoh, this radiant light was temporarily taken away from him, only to be fully restored when he stood on Mount Sinai to receive the Torah directly from God. From that pivotal moment onwards, Moses possessed this unique light until his death, which is why, as the Torah recounts, he had to veil his face when he came down from the mountain, as its brilliance was too much for the Israelites to bear.
Wow.
The Zohar emphasizes that wherever the phrase "and there was," vayhi in Hebrew, is used in connection with this light in the creation account, it signifies something that has a continuous existence, both in our current world and in the world to come.
And there's a sense that this light is both revealed at certain times and fundamentally concealed at others.
Absolutely. Rabbi Isaac explains in the Zohar that at the very moment of creation, God irradiated the entire world with this magnificent light, but it was subsequently withdrawn both as a deprivation for those who would choose to sin and as a precious treasure that was stored away for the righteous. As it says in the Psalms, light is sown for the righteous, Psalm 97.11. In the future, in a time of ultimate redemption, all the worlds will be in perfect harmony and united by the full revelation of this light. But until that time comes, it largely remains hidden from our ordinary perception. The Zohar further elaborates that this original light actually emerged from a primordial darkness that was itself hewn out by the strokes of the most secret, a very evocative phrase.
Yeah.
And similarly, from this hidden light, the darkness of the lower world, the world in which we currently exist and in which this original light inheres in a concealed form, was also created. This lower darkness is specifically identified as night in the creation account in Genesis 1:5. It's a cyclical and interconnected idea, with light emerging from darkness and darkness containing a potential for light.
It's a really profound way of thinking about the origins of both light and darkness. Moving on to the creation of man, how does the Zohar depict this pivotal event in the cosmic narrative?
Rabbi Simeon describes a moment of profound cosmic trembling as God was on the verge of creating humankind, with all the creatures both above in the celestial realms and below in the earthly realm filled with awe and anticipation. The divine decision was finally made on the 6th day of creation, and a radiant figure blazed forth from the divine presence, encompassing within itself both the male and female principles in a unified form.
Okay.
This primordial human form was then subsequently divided, and Adam, as we know him, was formed from one of these sides.
And what about the creation of woman?
Right.
The Zohar touches upon a slightly different figure that existed before Eve, doesn't it?
Yes, the Zohar refers to an earlier tradition that it says is found in ancient books.
Okay.
This tradition states that the one taken from Adam's side, Genesis 2:21 in the biblical account, actually refers to the original Lilith, who cohabited with him and bore him offspring.
Yeah.
However, according to this tradition, she was not found to be a suitable helpmate for him, echoing the sentiment expressed in Genesis 2:21, where it said that Adam found no fitting partner among all the animals. The Zohar emphasizes that Adam was the last to be created in the sequence, implying that he was intended to find a world that was already complete and prepared upon his arrival.
And the Zohar also offers a reason why Adam and Eve weren't initially created face-to-face, but rather side by side.
Exactly. Rabbi Simeon explains that they were initially created side by side because in the early stages of creation, heaven and earth were not yet in a state of complete harmony, a lack that is hinted at by the absence of rain mentioned in Genesis 2.5. It was only when the lower union, that is, the connection and eventual harmonious relationship between Adam and Eve was perfected, and they turned to face each other, that the upper union, the complete and stable harmony between the celestial and earthly realms, was also perfected.
Okay.
The Zohar draws a powerful analogy here with the construction of the tabernacle. The lower structure of the tabernacle had to be erected and in place before the upper, more sacred elements could be raised and established. Similarly, this initial imperfection in the cosmic harmony above necessitated that Adam and Eve were not created face-to-face from the outset. The specific order of the verses in Genesis, mentioning the lack of rain and then the absence of man to till the ground, further signifies humanity's initial state of incompleteness, which was rectified only with the perfection and arrival of Eve. It's a fascinating interpretation that beautifully links the creation of humanity to the broader cosmic order.
It truly is. The next topic in our selective readings is male and female, where the Zohar delves deeper into the spiritual significance of the relationship between them.
Yes. Here the Zohar explores the profound spiritual significance of the union between male and female.
Okay.
Rabbi Simeon highlights the core idea that just as the Holy One, blessed be He, has a mystical union with the community of Israel, often depicted as a feminine entity, so too should a man strive for a deep and meaningful union with his wife. He emphasizes the crucial importance of joy in this marital union, even comparing it in its spiritual significance to the joy that is experienced on the Sabbath, a time of profound spiritual connection and rest.
And there's a sense in the Zohar that even when a husband and wife are physically separated, a spiritual connection between them still endures.
Yes. The Zohar suggests that students of Torah who may be physically separated from their wives for 6 days of the week while they're diligently engaged in their studies are during this time spiritually attached to a heavenly mate. This ensures that they do not cease to be male and female on a spiritual level, maintaining their wholeness even in physical separation. That upon the arrival of the Sabbath, it becomes particularly incumbent upon them to rejoice and reunite with their wives, honoring both their earthly bond and the heavenly union, and in doing so, fulfilling the will of their master. Similarly, during the time when a wife is ritually separated from her husband, the Zohar states that the husband also has a corresponding heavenly mate, ensuring that his spiritual state is maintained during this period. So the concept of male and female in the Zohar clearly transcends the purely physical realm and points towards a deeper spiritual reality.
It's a fascinating perspective that elevates the marital relationship to a level of deep spiritual significance, directly connecting it to the divine. The Zohar also seems to emphasize the crucial role that the wife plays within the household.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Zohar states quite clearly that a man's house is blessed specifically through his wife, indicating that the divine presence does not depart from a home due to her inherent merit and righteousness. The verse, "And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent," Genesis 24.67, is interpreted in a mystical sense as signifying that the divine presence which had dwelt in Sarah's tent came to dwell in Isaac's house, along with Rebekah when he brought her there.
Okay.
According to the secret teachings within the Zohar, the supernal mother, which represents a divine feminine aspect within the Godhead, is united with the male principle only when the house is properly prepared, and specifically at the time of conjugal union, showering profound blessings upon the couple and their home.
This really elevates the marital relationship to a level of spiritual partnership deeply intertwined with the divine presence. The next theme we encounter is consuming fire, which is a powerful and potentially quite dangerous image.
Yes. Rabbi Simeon grapples here with what might seem like a direct contradiction between two seemingly opposed verses from the Torah. The first is, "For the Lord thy God is a consuming fire," Deuteronomy 4.24, which evokes an image of divine power that can destroy. The second is, "But ye that cleave unto the Lord your God are alive, every one of you this day," Deuteronomy 4.4, which speaks of life in connection with the divine.
Right.
Rabbi Simeon resolves this apparent contradiction by describing two distinct kinds of lights that are associated with the divine. He speaks of one light that is white and perpetually glowing, representing a higher, unwavering, and benevolent aspect of God. And he describes another light, positioned beneath it, which is blue or even black in its appearance. This lower light is the one upon which the higher white light rests.
And this lower light, the blue or black one, that's the consuming fire that the Zohar is referring to.
Yes, exactly. This blue or black light is described as being intrinsically connected to something below it that constantly sustains it,
Ugh.
and also powerfully binds it to the white light that is above it. This lower light has a potential to sometimes turn a fiery red color, and is characterized as being an instrument of destruction and death, capable of utterly devouring anything that comes too near to it from below.
Oh, wow.
In stark contrast, the white light above is described as being pure and unchanging, neither consuming nor being consumed. Moses' statement about God being a consuming fire is therefore interpreted by the Zohar as specifically referring to this lower blue or black flame, which actively consumes and annihilates whatever cleaves to it from the lower realms. Yet those who cleave directly to the Lord, and in this context, that specifically means cleaving to the higher, purer white light, remain vibrantly alive and connected to the source of life. So you see, it's all about which aspect of the divine one chooses to draw near.
So it's a matter of aligning oneself with the appropriate aspect of divine energy. And it sounds like there's yet another light that exists even beyond this white light that you've described.
Yes, almost imperceptible. Positioned above, and yet encompassing the white light, is another even more subtle light. This represents the supreme and utterly transcendent essence of the divine. The aspiring flame, the very act of reaching upwards in spiritual aspiration, is seen as a potent symbol of the supernal mysteries of divine wisdom. Rabbi Phineas, upon hearing this profound explanation, expresses his deep gratitude and praises God for guiding him to this level of understanding. Rabbi Simeon then further explains that within the sacred four-letter name of God, YHVH, the second letter, He, mystically represents this blue or black light, which is intrinsically attached to the other letters Yod, He, and Vav, which together constitute the luminous and benevolent white light. There are specific times, particularly during the offering of sacrifices, when this lower blue light rises and joins with the white light above. It needs to ascend in this way to perform its function of consuming the fat and flesh from below. At such sacred times of offering and unification, the Zohar teaches that a profound state of peace reigns throughout all the worlds, and all of creation is drawn into a state of perfect unity. It's a complex but deeply evocative image of divine energy with different aspects serving distinct functions, both benevolent in their higher nature and potentially destructive when interacting with the lower realms.
It certainly is a complex image, hinting at the multifaceted nature of the divine. The next stage in our journey through the Zohar's teachings is departure from life, which deals with the profound mystery of death.
Yes. The Zohar presents a very poignant and almost theatrical image of Adam, the first man, appearing before someone at the very hour of their death. Adam is depicted as asking the departing soul why they are choosing to leave the world and in what spiritual state they find themselves. The dying person often responds with deep lament and sorrow, sometimes even laying blame on Adam for the advent of death itself. However, Adam, in this Zoharic depiction, responds by pointing out that he only broke a single divine commandment and received his due punishment, whereas the individual now facing death has likely transgressed many more commandments throughout their lifetime. Rabbi Hia adds another layer to this image, stating that Adam continues to exist in a spiritual form and regularly confesses his own transgressions before the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, twice every day, showing them the elevated place of heavenly glory that he has now lost.
Wow.
So the Zohar shifts the responsibility for death away from Adam's original sin and places it more on the individual's own actions and choices during their life. And there's a specific purpose to Adam's appearance at this critical moment. Rabbi Yessa clarifies that Adam comes before every person at the moment of their death, specifically to declare that their demise is ultimately due to their own sins, echoing the ancient rabbinic saying, "There is no death without sin." It's a sobering, but perhaps ultimately empowering thought, emphasizing individual accountability.
A sobering thought indeed, but one that underscores the importance of our choices. The next topic in our selection, the three strands of spirit, delves into the different aspects or levels of the human soul as understood by the Zohar.
Rabbi Hia uses a vivid analogy to explain the emergence of these three strands. He compares it to a man entering a dark cave and finding three distinct children emerging from within. One who is clearly virtuous in their demeanor, one who seems inherently evil, and one who is simply ordinary.
Okay.
Similarly, the Zohar posits that there are three fundamental strands or components of the human spirit: the nephesh, often translated as the vital soul or life force, the ruah, the spirit associated with emotions and intellect, and the neshama, the super soul or holy soul representing the highest level of spiritual connection.
Okay.
These three strands are not static. They move and are drawn into different spiritual worlds depending on the individual's actions and spiritual development. The neshama is described as issuing forth from a higher realm and is then joined by the ruah as it descends.